All right, everybody, you just tuned into Random Radio. Welcome to another exciting episode of Just Ask, the podcast where you ask the questions and we give you the answers. I'm your host, Nicholas John Random, and we are once again live at the Stimulus Cafe and Coffee House in Durango, Colorado. Today's question is going to be all about music. So, we got a question from Tony. Tony says that he's a huge Led Zeppelin fan. He grew up in the 80s and he's a huge Led Zeppelin fan, but recently a buddy of his just showed him a bunch of YouTube videos that seemed to indicate that Led Zeppelin stole all of their songs. And he wanted me to do a podcast on this to see if I could help him answer the question, did one of his favorite bands of all time steal all their songs? Are Led Zeppelin thieves of music? So that's what we're going to do a podcast on today, guys. Should be a pretty quick one. All right. Well, so how do we start this one off? First off, I want to say this. I was born in the 80s, so I still was part of that wonderful generation of, people who still listen to good old-fashioned rock and roll music. I was born in Missouri, and I grew up all over the country, Florida, California, New Jersey, Arizona, literally everywhere you can possibly imagine I've lived. But a large part of my life was growing up between Missouri and California. And when I lived in California, I lived in this little hippie town. When I lived in Missouri, I lived in, Missouri. So, it was a lot of that bluesy rock, classic, what we call classic rock these days. And Led Zeppelin was definitely a big part of my life. I'm a musician. I've played music my whole life. I started with musical instruments like the piano and the drums and things like that. I decided to pick up the guitar when I was about 15 years old, I think. 15, 16 years old. 16, probably. My first guitar, I bought it at a pawn shop. I went in there, I knew what I wanted. I wanted a guitar, an electric guitar, and I grabbed one, looked like a little SG from this terrible pawn shop in Florida where I was at the time. Didn't even bother to try it out. I didn't know anything about guitars, so I took it home and I plugged it in. Darn thing didn't work. And I spent the next year soldering that thing back together to get an electric guitar to work because I wanted to play that bad. Now, I used to say to people, the reason I picked up a guitar in the first place was because of Jimi Hendrix. Somebody gave me Live at the Fillmore East, and that was the reason I decided to play the guitar. I was like, whatever that is, that's what I want to play. But Jimmy Page with Led Zeppelin is the reason I kept playing guitar. So I started because of one Jimmy, and I kept going because of another. Jimmy Page is one of my favorite guitarists of all time. Not because he's crazy and insane and eccentric like Jimi Hendrix or Steve Vai or any of those guys, but because he's what we call a true master of the guitar. He has spent so long perfecting his music on the guitar that it's fantastic. So many years ago, I heard these rumors as well about Led Zeppelin, and I did a lot of research about it myself. So I'm here to clear up all the wishy-washy, did Led Zeppelin steal all their songs kind of stuff. The answer is there is no short answer. Led Zeppelin definitely did what we would call covers. That's what we're going to call them, of a lot of songs. Some of which were credited as the original writer, with the original writer's names on them, and some of them, unfortunately, weren't. Led Zeppelin, let's just go ahead and get into it. Okay, so Led Zeppelin started in the 60s. Now, here's a fun fact that most people don't know. There was a band called the Yardbirds, which was a very popular band. They played a lot of bluesy rock, very similar to Led Zeppelin. That started around the 60s. I don't remember when the Yardbirds started. Maybe 63. They had Eric Clapton, Jeff Beck, a bunch of guys that are very famous. We know them all, and they went on for a little while, and then some of them decided to separate. They fired Jeff Beck, and then things went downhill for the Yardbirds, and they separated. And Eric Clapton went on to do his thing, and a bunch of stuff. Well, when Clapton left for short term, Jimmy Page hopped in there, and then very, very quickly, the Yardbirds disbanded, and a new band formed around Jimmy Page, and they called themselves the New Yardbirds. Now they called themselves this mainly because the Yardbirds had some concerts that they had in contract ready to fill, and they needed to do them. So for for those reasons, they called themselves the New Yardbirds. But the New Yardbirds was just Led Zeppelin. So after those concerts were fulfilled, they came out and they liked their performances and their group that they had gotten together, and they decided to come up with a new name so they could go off and play music as their band. There's a lot of mythos when it comes to where the name Led Zeppelin came from. There's an old legend that says Keith Moon said you guys are going to go down like a Led Zeppelin, and that's how they got the name. But anyway, so around 1968-ish, Led Zeppelin was born in true form. And Led Zeppelin 1 was released in 1969. They went on to release 7 or 8 more albums, depending on what you call an album. So they did Led Zeppelin 1, then there was Led Zeppelin 2, then there was Led Zeppelin 3. Then there was an untitled album, which most people just refer to as Led Zeppelin 4. That was kind of a weird naming situation. Then they released an album called Houses of the Holy, then an album called Physical Graffiti, then Presence, and then a final album called In Through the Outdoor. Then John Bonham passed away, and effectively in 1980, Led Zeppelin was no more. And a few years later, they decided to take outtakes and songs that they had been working on for the album In Through the Outdoor, and they mashed them all together and released one more album called Coda. And people sometimes consider that a Led Zeppelin album, sometimes don't. I do, because even though the songs are kind of strange and very obviously not finished and kind of rough songs, they are the band. It's the whole band, and it's just songs that they hadn't released. So personally, I believe there are 9 official Led Zeppelin albums, not including the live albums, because there are live albums out there, just like any band has live albums. When it comes to the pirating or the stealing or the thievery of songs, how do we start this? So again, I want to say this. Jimmy Page is one of my favorite guitarists of all times. But he was in a generation of rock that was, when they were in England, they had discovered blues. There was a generation of rockers, psychedelic rockers, that had discovered blues music, American blues, and they loved it. And whenever they played it in England, the English teenagers and young people hadn't heard this amazing, powerful music. So they became very, very popular. A lot of British musicians became extremely popular from playing their versions of blues in England and around Europe. And that's kind of how Zeppelin started. That's definitely how Jimmy Page started. Jimmy Page had been a musician his entire life. He had picked up a guitar when he was extremely young. There's even old video footage of him on some TV shows playing skipple and other kinds of guitar music. So he had always been playing. He had been playing in young bands since he was a kid. He even was a session guitarist for a little while, and played music. Like, he was recording music. If you don't know what music is, it's elevator music. It's just background music. And he hated that, so he went back into getting into bands and things like that. And then it's the 60s, guys. So in the 60s, Jimmy Page started to do a lot of drugs, and he started to play in rock bands, and he started to play with his blues, psychedelic music. And he grew up on, when I say grew up, I mean grew up as a guitarist on these amazing American blues songs. So people like Willie Dixon and Howlin' Wolf and Muddy Waters and all these guys that wrote amazing blues songs, he would play those versions of those songs like when he was learning how to play the guitar, because that's what was, that was what was there. That was what he wanted to play. That was what he was striving for, was his version of this amazing American blues. It was so much feeling in those guitars. So he took a lot from the, Chess Records, the old Chess Records guys, namely Willie Dixon. Now, when it comes to thievery, I'm gonna start slow and go into it. First thing I want to say is this. Led Zeppelin, they did do a lot of what I will call covers of a lot of songs, but they wrote a lot of original amazing songs. Communication Breakdown, Heartbreaker, Ramble On, Immigrant Song, Black Dog, Battle of Evermore. All those songs are original songs. Tangerine kind of floats on the line because Tangerine was originally written by Jimmy Page, but for the Yardbirds. Now, some could argue that, well, it's a Yardbird song, but not really. It's a Jimmy Page song. He wrote that song, and he played it for a little bit in the short period of time he was in the Yardbirds, and then a little bit when he was in the new Yardbirds. But that's his song. The new Yardbirds were just Led Zeppelin. So that one's his. Good Times and Bad Times. So many What Is and Never Should Be. So many great original Led Zeppelin songs out there. So it's not like they stole everything, guys. Barnyard Stomp. So many good things. Celebration Day, Friends. But there are a lot of songs they did covers of. So let's start with Willie. Willie Dixon, again, huge inspiration on Jimmy Page particularly, and Robert Plant, and everybody in Zeppelin. So the songs You Shook Me and I Can't Quit You, those songs are Willie Dixon songs. But when they release them in the albums, they credit him with the song. So it says, it is always said, this song's written by Willie Dixon. Those are covers. That is a Led Zeppelin cover. I believe that's totally okay, especially with crediting. Let's see. So Whole Lot of Love. Whole Lot of Love. The music is pretty original, but mostly the lyrics are Willie Dixon. And they're not credited on the album, unfortunately. Again, now, so here's the thing. Because Led Zeppelin is so notorious, and they were so famous, they were so notorious with this did they or didn't they steal all their music kind of crap, a lot of these guys sued and won rights. So they're now, almost all these things I'm going to mention are now credited on all of their albums. What I'm talking about in this podcast is originally when these albums were produced in the 60s and the 70s. Some of these things weren't credited properly, and as such, they have been dubbed as people who stole music. So, like the song Whole Lot of Love, the lyrics were pretty much Willie Dixon lyrics written on some Jimmy Page music. It has been credited now later on, but it wasn't. Also, the song Bring It On Home. While the song itself is pretty original, the intro and the outro to that song are very much inspired from Willie Dixon. So basically, also, I want to point out something too. When I was talking about the fact that Jimmy Page and Robert Plant and all these guys, John Bonham and everybody, were inspired by all this blues music, they definitely were, and that shines very, very prevalently on their first couple of albums. But about album 5, after about Houses of the Holy and on, that's all original music. They barely did anything. That's pretty much all original music, with a couple of exceptions of covers that are properly credited. That's all original stuff. But the first couple of albums, like I said, they were very, very much into the blues, and so they definitely borrowed some stuff, and some of it, unfortunately, was not credited. Doesn't mean it isn't amazing. Generally, when we're talking about them covering or borrowing music, and even if it's uncredited or whatever, I'm going to be honest with you, they did a better job. They did a more interesting job with the music, and they just didn't credit a lot of it. So Lemon Song. Lemon Song is basically a song by Howlin' Wolf called Killin' Floor. It's basically the same song. And again, wasn't originally credited. Later on, it did get credited. When the Levee Breaks was credited. Like When the Levee Breaks was a song by Kansas Joe McCoy and Memphis Minnie. They did that song. It's a very popular Led Zeppelin song, but it was credited as a cover. And again, that's totally fine. That's not stealing. That's just because these guys did a lot of other people's songs doesn't mean they stole every one of them. They did properly cover them. One of my favorite songs by Led Zeppelin of all time, and it definitely was when I was growing up, is "Baby, I'm Gonna Leave You." When they recorded it, they thought it was a traditional folk song. It is a folk song. It is an old time traditional folk song, and they credited it as it's a folk song by Anne Bryden. I don't remember what her last name is, but they did credit it in the original album as traditional / Jimmy Page. And I think that's the best way to do it, because that's basically what it is. The reason I loved that song so much is because the melody sounds so peaceful and so beautiful, and Robert Plant is singing so subtly and so calmly for the beginning part of it, at least. But if you've ever tried to play "Baby, I'm Gonna Leave You," it's a hard song to learn on the guitar. It's not as easy as it sounds it is, which is that great thing about Zeppelin. It's that beautiful, complicated, peaceful music and rock. It's really complicated. Like "Baby, I'm Gonna Leave You" at the end starts to get really crazy. So that was kind of a traditional folk song. And again, in the end, Anne did get credited. She got some money and she got credited. "Gallows Pole," traditional blues song, credited as such. Let's see, what are some popular ones? Now, so here's one that has always driven me nuts. The one that they get the most guff from is "Stairway to Heaven." So "Stairway to Heaven," this is the one they've made the most YouTube videos about, and it really drives me nuts because years back, a band called Spirit sued Led Zeppelin, saying that the intro to "Stairway to Heaven" was ripped off of a song they did called "Taurus." And they did that song a few years before "Stairway to Heaven" came out. And Jimmy, they would have known who Spirit was. They were an American rock band who did the same kind of style music. And yes, they would have known who they were. And it's possible. I think they might have even toured at one point in time together. If you listen to both songs side by side, there is a very similar chord progression and the same similar notes. But if you've ever played music, you know that there's only so many notes. And while the chord progression is similar, it's not a riff. It's not the same in any way, shape, or form. Jimmy Page's "Stairway to Heaven" intro there's much more detail in the way it's played. There's much more, there's more notes. And I don't think it was riffed in any way, shape, or form. It is very, very, very possible that a completely stoned out Jimmy Page heard their song at some point in time, had it in his head, and then when he was writing music, freestyling all the time on acid and all sorts of other crazy drugs, freestyled this riff that was similar to theirs and was like, "That's amazing, we got to put it as the intro to this song." That's 100% possible and probably what I believe happened. So I don't believe that "Stairway to Heaven" was riffed off of anybody. I think they wrote that song and it's theirs. Also, the courts agreed. Whenever they were sued by Spirit, the courts eventually decided, even though Led Zeppelin has been sued and lost many, many times about a lot of their songs, they won this one, and the judge said that no, I'm sorry, just because you have the same notes and a similar chord progression for a tiny bit of a song doesn't mean it's a copy of a song. That's not like similar, but it wasn't the same. So no, "Stairway to Heaven" is not a ripoff. I don't believe that in any way, shape, or form. As a guitar player, I do not think that one is a ripoff at all. Let's see. "Since I've Been Loving You" is very similar to Moby Grape's song called "Never." It's very, very similar. So that one, it's pretty, he was never credited, and I think it's possible that they may have been doing a cover on that one. The song "Moby Dick," there's a riff. The riff of the song "Moby Dick" is definitely inspired by a song called Watch Your Step by Bobby Parker. It's not the same song, it's not the same lyrics, but it could have been inspired by them for sure. But again, a lot of drugs, a lot of music all around. I think that one was just an inspiration. Let's see. What are some other really, really big ones? Dazed and Confused. Everybody knows that song. Well, Dazed and Confused is pretty much a Jake Holmes song that's slightly different, you know. Jimmy's got his own take on some stuff, and at one point he pulls out a violin bow and starts playing on that thing. But it's pretty much this Jake Holmes song. And he used to open for the Yardbirds back in the day, so it's very obvious that that was a cover of a Jake Holmes song, uncredited originally. Black Mountain Side was probably inspired by Down by the Blackwater, which is a Burt Janisch song. Again, all those cats were kind of around each other and playing with each other. And I think that, again, with the drugs in the 60s and stuff like that, it's very possible that it was just heavily inspired by that song. But it's got his own. Jimmy Page is an amazing, ridiculous guitarist, and it's definitely Jimmy Page guitar. But the song Black Mountain Side was probably inspired by Janis. So the song How Many More Times, that one's kind of, again, unfortunately he didn't credit these guys, but it seems to be kind of a mashup of a couple of his songs that he liked back in the day, Jimmy Page that we're talking about. It's definitely a mashup of How Many More Years, which is a song by Howlin' Wolf. There's a little bit of a riff there that sounds very similar to a Jeff Beck song. There's also Albert King, The Hunter. A lot of that is mixed into that song, How Many More Times? And again, none of those guys were credited originally, so it's tricky. You know, when it comes to all of this stuff, years later, you know, as adults, years later as, you know, very famous grown, you know, guys who'd been sued now a couple of times for stealing songs. There's an interview specifically with Robert Plant where he's like, you know, you definitely stole the lyric. You guys definitely were doing a cover of that song. What's the deal? Why'd you put it on the album without credits or whatever? And Robert Plant basically says, well, you know, we didn't. It's not that we were trying to steal or anything like that. It's just that we really liked the song and we liked the way we played it, and we figured it sounded great. Let's put it on the album. And, you know, years from now, if anybody tries to sue us for stealing a song or something, well, that means we're probably made it and we're pretty famous. So it'll be the least of our worries, which is kind of a messed up way to look at it, but it's also 100% true. Like, they played the music and they did a great job with the music or whatever, and they did get so famous that people wanted to sue them or whatever, and they had the money to pay those people. And in that little problem, but at the same time they got to play their music and it sounded good. So it's a weird mentality, but you know, it is what it is. But I want you guys to remember this. Like I said, Led Zeppelin, they're definitely one of the greatest bands that come out of the 60s and 70s. They were freaking ridiculous. And yeah, they did a lot of covers that they didn't credit right away, but bands do that all the time. And especially if you switch into different music genres, you switch into R&B and hip hop and things like that. And you got guys, DJs and MCs that are stealing all sorts of licks from songs, changing them a slightly bit. And we're not talking about like they're playing a different version on a guitar like Jimmy Page. No, we're talking about they take the actual songs and just cut them up little bits and use them in their songs and leave it uncredited. Let's not forget the most famous Vanilla Ice, Ice Baby, you know, where he used Under Pressure by, you know, Queen and Bowie. That happens all the time in music, and since that lawsuit, they try to be a lot more sneaky about it, but it happens all the time. And also, remember this, not as a musician, I can tell you, it's really hard to come up with new songs, and not just new songs lyrically. Lyrics are a little bit easier, but like when it comes to new music, like music, it's very, very tricky because there are only so many notes and chords you can play on the guitar. Now you can do crazy solo-y stuff all the time, and that's where the fun is. But when it comes to the chord progressions and things like that, there's only so many, and that's just how music is. So there's a great video if you can find it. I can't remember what the name of the actual video is, but there's a band called The Axis of Awesome, who I'm going to rep right now because they're amazing, and I hope you guys don't mind that I'm saying your name, but you guys are absolutely amazing, and they do a couple of music videos where they do costume changes and everything about songs that all have the same chord progression, and watch it. Just watch those videos by those guys, and you will be amazed to realize how many songs actually have the same couple of chords, and that's it. That's just music. But I think that covers it, guys. So the answer to your question is, did Led Zeppelin steal all their songs? Absolutely not. They did not. Did they do a lot of covers that they didn't credit some of the artists? Yes. Yes, they did. Did they take a lot of inspiration from a lot of artists? Yes, they did. Did they steal all their music? Absolutely not. It's ridiculous. Ramble On, Heartbreaker, Black Dog, Communication Breakdown, Good Times, Bad Times. These are all original songs, and they're amazing. Led Zeppelin was an amazing band. And yeah, also, if you're a huge Jimmy Page fan and you want to understand what I meant when I said he's a true master, there's an amazing documentary film out there called It Might Get Loud. If you haven't watched this and you're a fan of music, I do suggest you watch it. It was started as a documentary about the guitar and ended up being a little bit something more. But it's Jimmy Page, The Edge from U2, and Jack White are the three musicians they decided to focus on. And they do a little bit about each one of their lives. They play a little music. They go into the guitar, the different ways they play the guitar. It is amazing, particularly when it comes to Jimmy Page and Jack White. And there's a scene. There's one of my favorite scenes in the documentary where Jimmy Page is beautifully playing the guitar and doing a voiceover over the top of it, talking about whispering to the thunder. If you get to that scene, just watch that scene. That's what I mean by he's a master. But I think that's going to be it for this one, guys. I know it was a little shorter, but yes, I think that should answer your question. They did a lot of covers, but they didn't steal all their music, guys. And Stairway to Heaven is 100% an original. I don't care what anybody says. If you like our stuff, don't forget to click that like button. If you feel like you want to support the podcast a little bit, head over to our Patreon account at patreon.com/randomradio and become a supporter. We'll get you some swag and some free, early episodes and things like that. If you have a question for me, send me an email or a message any way you can. If it's a good question, I will absolutely do a podcast on it. I love good questions, you know me. Once again, I've been your host, Nicholas John Random, and we have been at the Stimulus Cafe and Coffee House in beautiful Durango, Colorado. If you're ever in Colorado and Durango, you want to stop by for a delicious cup of coffee or a good conversation with your host here, I just might be there. And we'll catch you next time, guys.